We're now going to construct the lining for the body of the jacket. This is quite simple apart from the centre back seam, which has a little bit of detail. We need to make allowances on our pattern, which we've already done here, to cut away for the fabric that's folded on the vent of the jacket. Also, to make it easier for myself in the area of the vent, I've actually marked my centimetre seam allowance to know that this point here must align with that point there. So I can actually pin those points together, as I know that's what I'm aiming for as I come down the bottom here of the centre back seam. I've also drawn in some scallop shapes, just very gentle shapes. I'm going to start my centre back seam here at the original seam allowance, which takes a 2 centimetre step in from the raw edge. I'm going to sew straight for about 5 centimetres, and I'll say 3 scallops of about 7.5 centimetres each in length. Continue the centre back seam, then back out to 1 centimetre. This scalloping here gives extra ease for movement, but also holds this extra ease and pleat in place, so it's nice and clean with inside the garment. So I'm just going to put my raw edges together. Bear in mind with the lining, this is a little bit more slippery than other fabrics that you may have used. So we're going to back tack. Another thing to watch out when you start doing your lining, always check on a piece of scrap, because if your needle is blunt, it will scag and cause a distortion on your fabric. So we're going to go down 5 centimetres straight, and then we're going to start our scallops. There's nothing right or wrong with these. We're just going to, I've drawn the lines on there for you to see, but we can really do whatever shape. We still then at the top of the scallop have a centimetre seam allowance, and this is what we added onto the patterns when we were making the lining patterns. And making sure all the way that our 4 edges are together. And now I'm going to come back out to a normal centimetre seam allowance as we come down the centre back seam. And you can see here we're coming to the corners that I've drawn onto our fabric. So when I hit the bottom of that stitch line with the needle in, I need to pivot around and now sew what would be across the top of the vent of the lining. So this has to come all the way around. This can be a little bit fiddly. And you can see I want to stop 1 centimetre short on the underneath panel. So I've marked that line in, and I can come across and I can see where I want to stop. We'll trim our thread ends. And there we have our centre back seam, and that's the stitch across the top of the vent, and then the extra allowance here allows for attaching to the jacket vent. So we get a nice right angle there, and then we can see our scallops give us some movement and extra ease there, but this will be pressed flat so you won't notice them. It's only for the wearer. They will open out. Next, once our centre back seam is done, we can join all the other panels together. So it'll work out, we'll have a front, a side, the back, then side and front again. Then we can join shoulder seams together as well, so we have our body lining complete. We're now going to attach the lining up and around the edge of the facing and the back of the neck. When we machine stitch, we will actually start from the centre back and come down the left front and then the right front to make sure we have no twist within the lining. So as you can see here, I have the jacket front on the table with the right side of the facing uppermost for myself. So now if we have the lining, you can see here we want to put the right side of the lining to the right side of the facing. So you can see my seam allowances here, and we can start at the centre back neck. We can pin in position. There'll be a notch there on our collar stand. We can come around, making sure we match notches and position of our shoulder. We work our way down the front, and we know that we have an ease of 5 centimeters in this front section, which we're going to eliminate with a pleat. Now the pleat goes up on the wrong side, midpoint to armhole, but when we fold it over to the right side, sorry, I've just pinned that to there. So when we fold it over to the right side, you can see the pleat folds down. So we eliminate our 5 centimeters there. We pin this to our facing all the way down. And we need to unfold our hem, because the lining goes all the way down this little step here to this raw edge. The allowance you've got there will just be over 1 centimeter, so by the time you attach the lining, you only have a few mil of a gap between the previous seam. So make sure this seam allowance inside is out of the way and is not caught when we attach the lining. So it comes all the way down to the bottom. I say keeping that seam allowance out of the way. Now there will be ease, so make sure you put that in sort of from the break line down. That will be net, so we would expect that to look flat. Then you will have some ease over the shaping here, sort of chest area. Make sure that is eased in, and you don't be tempted to increase this pleat. We know that only has a 5 centimeter value because that's what we added onto the shoulder. So you'll do that on both sides, and then once it's attached, it folds back on itself, and then all the seams within the jacket will be hidden. So once we've machined down both fronts, I'm giving it a light press just to push the lining back there on itself. We're going to concentrate on the vent. However, you could, if you wish, before you started doing the hem and the vent, do a top stitch detail up here. This is quite common in tailoring on the finishes of it inside of a jacket, but that is your preference. It is not necessary. So working on the lining of the jacket at the vent area, to hopefully help with visibility, I'm working on a smaller back section which I've recreated rather than the mass of the whole jacket. So just to recap, what we have here is our hem allowances have been folded up on our back panel. Our vent has been folded over. We are making sure that from the right side, the under vent is not visible. Also, we have hand stitched into place, folding back the vent, the top section here, catching interfacing to interfacing. Also on the hems, folding in half, we have stitched up our hem allowances on both sides. There are also areas of the front of the jacket which we discussed which would also be hand stitched up. This would be where we have the canvas areas to make it secure. We haven't stitched on the edge of our hem because we want to machine our lining to this edge. And we haven't gone right to the corners because we want to be able to manipulate our corners during construction. So we've had to stitch back from these edges to make it possible. So the first part of the vent in the construction is then lining up the top of the vent. So here we align where we stopped on the vent, on the body lining. That edge of our seam matches the edge of the seam of the vent on the jacket where we stopped a centimetre short. So we have a seam allowance free on both. And it is this that we're going to join together. Now we're going to work on the wider section of the vent first, as this is more vulnerable because we have our hand stitching inside. So we don't want to pull and distort this too much because we want to keep that stitching intact. So we would put our right sides together of our lining. So we can see our last stitch there. So this is going to match to our last stitch at the top of the vent, right sides together. And we are going to stitch down the side of the vent. Now we're only going to come down a few centimetres because what we're going to do at the moment, we're just going to secure the top of the vent into position. So we'll stitch down the first side just a few centimetres to hold it into place, and then we will right sides together stitch down the other side, again just a few centimetres to hold it in place, and then we'll start working on the hem edges as well. So here at the top of the vent, at the back of the jacket body, I'm going to pin my seam allowance back out of the way because we only want to be sewing on the underside of the vent. So I'm just going to put a pin in there to make sure I don't catch it in my construction. And then on the lining, as we said, this side here is right side to our vent. So our top stitch there, yeah, you can just see the stitch of the seam. If we fold it, you can see your seam there. We're folding that out the way, and that stitch is now going to match to this top stitch there. We can see the little bit of white on the vent. So we're going to make sure This piece of the vent is out of the way because it's right side of lining and jacket vent together. We can always put a pin in the top just to secure. And you can see we're going to start where our black stitching of our lining has stopped. And we're going to come down the side of the vent. So I'm just checking that the other piece of the vent is out of the way, right sides together. And we're just going to come down here a few centimeters. I'm not worrying about a back tack because I will be going back over this seam and securing it in place later. I can take out my pin, and then if we open that up we can see we've stitched close to the side of our vent. Now if we take out our pin to release the other side of the vent, then on our lining, you can see we would then do right sides together. Pushing the side of the vent we've just constructed out of the way this time. And we're going to stitch centimetre seam down a few centimeters. Back stitch for security. Let's get our raw edges together and our centimetre seam allowance. I say just down that few centimeters to hold the top of the vent in place when we're working in other areas. So if I flip this over now, we can see the top of the vent is constructed. So we have our lining attached to our vent at the top. We now need to work out the hem edges. So I've secured the top of the vent and I have pressed to make sure I'm happy with the finish. So now I'm going to go down to the hem edges. So here, right sides together. So we've pressed up the hem, but I'm going to go right sides together, and I've got plenty of room to work with because our hems are not attached. I am going to stitch across the hem, again just a few centimeters to secure this area. So what we're doing, we're working at the top of the vent to secure it in position, then we're working at the hem edge to secure it in position, and then we're joining the two. So I'm going to back tack and I'm going to stitch across our centimetre seam allowance. Be careful because you will have your hem stitched up, so you don't want to pull too hard in this area to break that stitching. So you can come across 10 to 15 centimetres maybe. As I've only got the back panel here as a section, I'm going to work my way across to the edge. we need to trim our thread ends as usual to keep the work clean. So after stitching across the hem on our first side, we are now going to finish closing the vent. Now this is the narrow side of the vent that we only have our centimetre seam allowance here to fold back. This is not the wider side of the vent, as they both have to be treated slightly different on the hem. So we can see where we've attached our hem, the lining will automatically want to fold into position. So we can go between our hem, because we've only stitched across the bottom so far, turn it through, and we can continue stitching down this side of the vent. As we do so, the hem edge will be folding up to the other side on the crease that we've made, and the lining will fold at the same time. The lining won't go all the way down. Move our frayed ends there. The lining doesn't go all the way down to the fold of the hem edge because the lining is shorter and we don't want it to be seen, but it will be pretty close to the edge. You'll put all your layers together and stitch straight down. I'm just going to start off my seam where I left off. I'm going to back tack 1 or 2 stitches, and as I come down towards the hem, I'm going to put a pin so it's clear to see my pre-pressed edge, because that's where we want to fold back on ourselves. We want to make sure that the lining is flush to the edge and smooth, there's no gathers on our seam. And when we come to this point, we will fold our hem edges back to our pin, and the lining, where necessary, will not hit the bottom hem edge, but the lining stays flat. Make sure you catch all the lining on the raw edges together. We don't want any non-inclusion. So we're folding our hem and back tack to secure. We will turn this through to the right side. So you can take your time to make sure we pull the corner of our hem through, but you can see that the hem is shorter, it's attached at the top, and that side of our vent is complete. It just requires extra care to poke through on our corner and to press this side of our vent in place. As we've done on the sleeve lining, we've back stitched here as a detail. If you want to, you could do a top stitch detail, but I'm just going to press to hold this in place. So after pressing and turning through our corner correctly, I'm now going to work on the other side of the vent. So what I've done here, I've put a pin to mark the edge of the vent. I'm going to unfold, and then I'm going to put right sides together of our lining and our hem. but I'm going to allow a centimetre on my lining past the pin because I need this to attach to the side of my vent. And then I'm going to sew my hem edges together just to secure into position. Just like we did on the other side, but we need to come across the width of the vent. So I'm going to start stitching from my pin to allow some freedom of this seam. So our centimetre seam allowance attach from the pin across my hem edge. Make sure you're not catching anything else. Remember, you'll have all the jacket to be working with. So that's why we're just stitching small areas to secure so that we can work with rather than the whole thing. So if anything gets trapped that shouldn't, or if things don't work out, it's much easier for you to unpick. So that's the first stage of the wide side of the vent. So if we turn it through, you can see now our lining is attached there, but now we need to sew down the other side of the vent. So our lining should fold and stop the same depth from the hem as the previously completed side of the vent. So as you can see, the lining does not go all the way down to the hem on both sides, so they should match, because this side of the vent, when completed, will sit next to there. So I'm now going to go between our layers, right sides together to stitch down our vent, folding the hem back just as we did on the other side. It's going to look a little bit different because we have the width of the vent folded back. So we're between our layers. We're going to go right sides together, down our vent. We can see where I left my centimetre not attached on the hem edge, because this is going to fold back on itself, as is the hem of the vent. And then we're going to stitch down there, down the side of the vent, making sure we don't catch anything else. There's a little bit of a twist going on here, but we just want to make sure we catch these raw edges together. Be careful of our hand stitching on our hems and our vents as well. We don't want to break any of them. So as on the previous side, we're going to back tack and start just above the seam we've already got constructed. We have our pressed line here, which is where we know our hem edge is going to fold back on itself. Then we need to pull this lining across and fold it up with the same gap at the bottom as our other side. So if I come down a little bit further, so I can be sure you're in shot. Okay, so I want my lining to be 5 mil away from the hem. So it's going to sit like so, just fold it up on itself, but then the hem gets folded up at the pin. So we move this bit of fullness of fabric out of the way. We don't want to catch that. Back tack for security. Trim off our thread ends. And then turn our work back through. So we can see we've finished off the vent edge on the other side. And we have our vent edge on the first side we completed. We do, however, have a hole here, so we can just slip stitch by hand across there to seal that section of the hem. And that is our vent completed. So when our vent edges are complete, we can then close and secure the hem edge from the front. So again, we will secure 10 to 15 centimeters to hold this in place on both sides, and then we can go through the opening around the vent to complete one side, and then through the armhole down to complete the other side. So from the front edge where we have our facing, we are now going to put right sides together to stitch across the beginning of our hem. Now, this is not folded on the seam where the lining is attached to the facing, but we fold it on the seam where the facing was attached to the jacket. So this is where it folds back on itself. So we actually have the lining attached seam sitting behind. So we then have raw edges together and take our centimetre seam allowance. You can see we have our hem stitched in place here to our canvas. So again, we need to be careful. We don't need to pull. We just gently need to manipulate to get access to be able to lay our raw edges together and sew across the hem. So we can gently move the lining forward, placing our jacket onto it. And then trim all your thread ends, and when we turn it through, you can see the lining, the step we had on the facing tucks up inside, and the lining then is attached on our hem of our jacket. Okay, so when we have the front hem sewn on each side and we have our vent edges secure, there is still a hole in the middle, but you can go through here, up over the vent and pull this side through. So we're going to go up, we're going to go over the vent, and we're going to come through this side. Then we can pull through and right sides together and continue that seam till it joins the vent edge. Then it will pull back through and it will be completed. Now for the other side, we can't go through the hem edge because we've just sealed it. So for this side, we use our armhole edge, which on the lining is not yet attached to the jacket. So we go down between the two layers, the lining and the jacket. We work our way down to the hem. We then pull it through the armhole, and then we continue our seam that we have joining our hem at the front to the vent. And then this pushes back through, and that means our hems will be complete. And that's all machined in around the facing edges, vent and hem. So what we're left with then is our armhole edge, which needs to be secured, which needs to be basted into place, and then our sleeve lining. So next we need to baste the body lining around the armhole of the jacket. So I've matched up my seams. This includes my shoulder seam and my side panel seams to the body of the jacket. And then I've taken out the 5 centimetre allowance we added on our front lining, making it opposite the pleat we have on our facing. So I'm going to baste this into position within my seam allowance, so we know we have a centimetre seam allowance. Now it would be possible from the shoulder pad to the underarm back to the shoulder pad to machine baste this in. We could follow the row of stitching that we have for the sleeve insertion, but I'm just going to baste this in by hand. So I'm going to follow the line we have here. So I'm going to back stitch baste this in so it's a little bit more secure than if we just did a running stitch. So I've got it pinned, more edges together, and I've got the sleeve seam facing me, so I just make sure I don't go past the machine stitching, because obviously, as all our other basting, we don't want this visible from the right side. I'm just going to take your time. This needs to be a little bit more control in the size of your stitches doing this. We don't want them to be too large. We want them to actually hold the body lining into position. Even if you did machine stitch in the lining and the underarm section where there isn't the bulk, you'd still need to hand baste in over the shoulder pad area. So I'm going to do this all the way around, which is going to take a little bit of time. So I'm going to stop recording and then we can see it once it's completed.